Is it on? Okay. All right. As you look at this, everything that says exam 2 is going to be what's going to be on the exam. And I haven't quite got everything in there yet, but I got a decent chunk of the stuff. So when you go in there, you'll notice today, since the morning class, I did go in and I put the spanking article in there. I put the protecting our kids article in there under video links now. I put a video in there that deals with differences between the House and the Senate. It's probably a good place to start as you think about this. And then I've also got the Georgia sex offender law, naked man drinking coffee, and I'm going to throw in there as well the BMI calculator as well. But let's just go ahead and start at the beginning here with Chapter 5. Any questions that y'all have regarding civil rights for tomorrow, or for Friday, I should say? Anything jumping out? Any of the terms? Anything at all?
Yeah, can you go over Buck versus Bell?
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Anything else? Go ahead.
When did you, how do you say, upload the civil rights questions in Chapter 5?
I thought that was up there the whole time. Okay, but that's not really for the review. We'll talk about that later. Let's just deal with review questions because the tape is burning. Yeah. Not everybody at once.
Oh, invidious discrimination.
What was invidious discrimination?
Oh, yeah.
Anybody at all? Invidious discrimination. We just did this the other day, in fact. I think I've mentioned to you before that discrimination is actually legal in the country. And not all of it is, to be sure, but some of it is. I'll go ahead and upload this page. I'll upload this page, but then this is one of the things that I have not yet quite put in. But if you remember, I went over this. The court has stated that it only prohibits invidious discrimination, that is, discriminatory acts that have no rational basis. And if you remember when we were talking about this, I had said that you got to be 16 to drive, 18 to smoke, 21 to drink, these kinds of things. And technically that's discrimination against people that are younger than 16, 18, and 21. But evidently there's a rational basis for that. I made mention to y'all about, like, I'm not going to hire somebody because they're blonde, or I'm not going to hire somebody because they're a soccer fan. Is there really a rational basis for that? There really isn't a rational basis for that. So that wouldn't be allowed. And then I think, do you remember the other example that I mentioned that some of y'all very sickly laughed at in all the classes? Do you remember the sign that says you got to be at least this tall to ride this ride? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that actually, the rational basis is if these little kids would get thrown out to their death. Well, that's not, that's a pretty rational basis. That's not invidious discrimination. So the idea is that as long as you've got kind of a rational reason for discriminating, it is legal to do, but it is hard to establish that rational basis. What else have y'all got for civil rights?
The 15th Amendment? Isn't that basically where it said you can't, no person shall be, denied rights or whatever because of, this and this?
15th Amendment is a really big deal. What was the wording of the 15th Amendment? Go ahead.
That no man shall be denied the right to vote based off of their race, the color of their skin, or their previous condition of servitude.
Previous condition of servitude. And I mentioned to you this idea of videos before. When you go into video links, you're going to notice in here this 15th Amendment and voting rights test video. Take a really good look at this. It's only about 5 minutes long, but it breaks down the different tests that were there. What was the significance? And remember, I had somebody in all of the classes write an amendment. You remember this? Write an amendment. How would you give the newly freedmen the right to vote? And people gave me some very interesting amendments, as I recall. But I asked you, once that we had gotten this done, I had asked you, okay, what's the difference between the 15th Amendment and their amendments that they had drafted? Do you remember what it was? What was significant about the language or the wording of the 15th Amendment?
Because there are other ways to deny people the right to vote that are highly subjective and
Okay. Other ways, tell me more.
And it didn't actually give the newly freed African Americans the right to vote. It just said that they can't be denied the right to vote for very specific reasons.
That's the significant piece. Remember what it says in there. It says the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Many of the amendments that y'all gave me in some form said the newly freedmen shall have the right to vote. Well, that gives you the right to vote when it says that. But when it says it shall not be denied for these other three reasons, shall not be denied for race, color, previous condition of servitude, then the implication is you can deny for other reasons. Do you remember some of the tests that they had? Go ahead.
Soap bubble test.
Soap bubble test. How the soap bubble test work?
It's like you had to like lather up. Like
Zoom in on her while she's doing it. Go ahead.
You had to like lather up soap, and like then you'd have to count the bubbles.
Yeah, they would ask you something to the effect of how many bubbles are in this bar soap. And I asked all the classes the same question. Can you really count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap? No, there's really no way. Did the people that were working the polls know the answer to that question? No, they knew who they really wanted to vote, and they know who they didn't. Was this denying on account of race, color, previous condition of servitude? Why were they being denied the right to vote?
Couldn't get the number right.
Because they didn't know how many bubbles were in a bar of soap. Why could you also say that this wasn't based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude?
Because they could fail white people for it too.
And they did. They not only failed the newly freedmen, but they did fail a good chunk of poor whites as well. So that would take away that racial piece. Although race played a role, it wouldn't have been the only role. Can you give me another voting right? Go ahead, Lily.
The jelly bean test.
What was the jelly bean test?
You had to know how many jelly beans were in the jar.
Had to know how many jelly beans were in a jar. Why would this be a problem for a newly freedman? Or why would this be a problem for you?
Because you're not allowed to like pick and see. You just have to look at the jar and see how much it is.
Yeah, you're not going to be allowed to touch them. You're not going to be allowed to spill the jar and spread them out. You're going to have to kind of guess on this. Did the people that were working the polls typically really know how many jelly beans were in those jars? No, they really didn't. But again, they knew who they wanted to vote. Was this denying on account of race, color, previous condition of servitude? It was denied based on what? Not knowing the number of jelly beans that were actually in the jar. What was another reason why the newly freedmen would have had trouble with this?
They couldn't count.
They couldn't count. You know, if you were a poor white or a newly freedman, you wouldn't have been especially educated. And if this was a pretty big jar, you wouldn't have been able to count that high anyway, even if you could have spread them out. So these were tests that were designed to skirt the 15th Amendment. But again, going back to what we had said, if the amendment that your class wrote, and all of them did, said the newly freedmen in some form shall have the right to vote, none of these tests matter because you gave specifically the right to vote. Give me another test that we talked about. Go ahead, Maria.
The literacy.
The literacy test. What was the literacy test?
Being able to read and write.
Being able to read and write. Elaborate, anybody on that? Because that's the beginning of it, but what would they do?
They would.
What's that?
Like hard words, they make them read like difficult pieces.
They would have to read hard words.
Sure, yes.
Yeah, she's FaceTiming, isn't she? Yeah, she can see you blushing. Yeah. Okay, I throw this out. Okay, there were 3 or 4 different variations on a literacy test, and one of them, the most basic one, was they were actually going to require you to read and explain a passage. Okay, the most basic one was you'd have to read and explain a passage, and if these poll workers wanted you to vote, they would give you an easier passage, and if they didn't want you to vote, they would actually give you a harder passage, and again, they would deny the newly freedmen, they would also deny the poor whites. Can you give me any other, I guess, versions of this? Go ahead.
The Selma video.
What about the Selma video? That's really good.
She was, other than being threatened that she would lose her job, she was supposed to, I think, write, I don't
really remember too much.
What-
She was asked this question.
What kind of questions was she
How many
asked?
judges were in the county, and she was supposed to name all of them.
Yeah, it started off with stuff that maybe wouldn't have been bad. I think he asked her to recite the preamble. Do you know what a preamble is? And you're right. There was kind of that intimidation there. The idea, oh my God, you know, I'm going to tell Mr. Dunn over at the rest home, you know, his girl over here raising a fuss kind of a thing. So you're right with that. The preamble. And then he started to get frustrated with her, and you notice he said, how many judges are in this, how many county judges are in the state of Alabama? And I think the number was 69. And then when she got it right, and he was really getting frustrated now, he said, give me all their names. And if you remember when we talked about this, a number of y'all went to mock court, and y'all don't remember the judge that we sat down with that day. And y'all had a face-to-face for an hour with that man. However, if you had to name all 69 county judges in Alabama, and some of these counties you ain't ever going to go to in your life, much less have been there to that point, you're not going to know these people. This is something that you wouldn't know. And how many questions could they ask? Do you remember? As much
As much as they
as,
As much as they want.
as much as they. Is that really what it was, or was there a clear way that you could kind of determine how many questions? Okay, I got somebody saying 3 back there. No, that's how many licks it takes to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop. Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
They just ask questions until they got it wrong.
They asked questions until they got it wrong. That's exactly what it was. And if you remember from that video, I put that thing up, the education of the black man ought to be, you know, and all of the words were spelled wrong. The people that were giving the literacy tests were often not able to pass them themselves, but they knew who was supposed to vote and they knew who wasn't. And the newly freedmen and the poor whites weren't supposed to vote. At least that was what the mindset was. There were questions in there too. You know, well, name 2 things that describe Congress. And, you know, I mean, there were a number of different questions that I had shown you in the video. Take a look at that, you know, and make sure that you're comfortable with some of those, because, man, I tell you, that's a damn good video that I produced, you know, at the Lincoln that day. Take a good look at that. So, literacy test, jelly bean test, soap bubble test, any others? Uh-oh. Anybody remember the poll tax? Go ahead, Alex. What was the poll tax?
So basically, you had to pay like some, like fee or whatever, like $5 or something
Yeah.
like that, depending on the wherever you were.
Yeah.
And then you weren't allowed to vote unless you had it with you.
Yeah.
And if you lost it, like sorry,
Well,
not-
have what with you?
like the stamp, like the little like
The
receipt.
receipt.
The receipt, yeah, there you go. The poll tax, and if you watch, when you watch the video again, the poll tax was typically maybe $1 or $2, or maybe in some instances $5. And if you remember, that translated maybe somewhere between 15 and 20, maybe even up to $50 in today's terms that you would have to pay in order to be able to vote. Well, the simplest way that they would ban you was if you were poor to the point where you couldn't pay it, then you were banned. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Are you being banned because of race, color, previous? No, you're banned because you couldn't pay the poll tax. And again, they did it to both races. Well, the other piece was they would set these deadlines. You remember the deadlines? So you'd have to pay the poll tax by such and such date. And if you missed that date, even if you showed up on election day with the money, they were going to turn you away. And to your point about the receipt, you would pay in advance. You would get the receipt, but then you'd have to present the receipt the day of the election. And even if you paid it, but you didn't have the receipt, they weren't going to let you vote. And if you remember, I'd asked somebody in all the classes, did you buy something yesterday? Do you still have the receipt? Every class said, no, I still ain't got the receipt. And y'all are educated 21st century college folk. Imagine what these poor folks, you know, newly freedmen, uneducated, they're not going to be, I mean, they're working people. They're not going to be able to keep up with this nearly as well as y'all do, and y'all weren't keeping up with it either. You remember what go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, did they tell them